Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for this yet. I think it's almost certainly Ukraine military or state security services. And they're trying to rattle the Kremlin at a time when Russia, of course, continues to try to break Ukraine with the aerial, with the ground attacks. And when Vladimir Putin keeps blustering, as he did for 4 hours last Friday, that Russia is going to win this and is going to seize more territory. The general in this case is Fanil Savarov. He was head of the operational training directive of the Russian military. That's the unit that oversees the combat training and readiness. So it prepares everyone for going to the front lines in Ukraine. He had been involved in the invasion of Ukraine before he took up that post. And he had been involved in Russian wars on Chechnya and Russia's military intervention to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. So he's got a great deal of experience. But he is the third general to have been killed in the last year. So it's not like this is a sudden vulnerability. This is an ongoing vulnerability. After the second assassination, which took place earlier this year, Vladimir Putin said, this is unacceptable. We have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, it has. And again, they got to the car in which he was riding. They got an explosive device underneath it. It detonated a few seconds after the car started to roll, reportedly out of a courtyard or out of a parking garage. And, every Russian military commander is going to be thinking, okay, wait, better double check my security, better think about what's going on here. And Vladimir Putin, he'll keep blustering, but you got to think there's a thought in his head that the combination of this with Ukraine's ongoing attacks on Russian military installations, including oil refineries, including logistics depots, including petrochemical plants, including naval bases. Several Russian tankers have been blown up in recent days. And in combination with Russia's economic problems, you got to think, maybe, does this give Putin just a flutter that at some point he's going to have to row back from his attempt to conquer his neighbor?
The support provided by the European Union, that 90 billion euros that have been provided to Ukraine, they've come out of bonds. It's not as big as the package Ukraine might have hoped for, but that number does seem to fit to be enough to at least get Ukraine through 2026, doesn't it?
Well, it's 2/3 of what they need through 2027. And so the estimate, they needed 135 billion. And it was kind of neat. One of the reasons why they were going for the reparations loan option drawn from the frozen assets is it kind of worked out quite neatly. And that is, look, Ukraine needs 135 billion. We've got 210 billion of Russian assets here. You take about 2/3 of the Russian assets that we've got, that works out at 135. And then, of course, Belgium stood in the way of that. And, I won't go into the details of why Belgium stood in the way to it, but they just weren't simply going to budge. And at that point where they're not going to budge, it's like, okay, now, and this was, this is a serious thing, because it's like, if the EU cannot provide the financial support for Ukraine, because all of Ukraine's taxes goes to its military, how do you keep, transport, education, healthcare, other essential public services? How do you protect the Ukrainian public when Russia's trying to bomb all those services out of existence? And Ursula von der Leyen flagged up a couple of weeks ago. So this wasn't entirely out of the blue. She flagged up the option, which was, look, we'll take 90 billion from the frozen Russian assets, and we'll take 45 billion, we'll borrow it against the markets. Right? And what was interesting is that we got into this would have been last Friday, when the rubber hits the road, and Belgium's not going to budge. And it was quite clear. And you've got to say that the EU worked over the next 24 hours. And it was like, we are going to, and Antonio Costa, the European Council President, European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen said, we're not leaving here till we get a deal. We'll stay through the weekend. And the story is, and this is an interesting part of it, supposedly Italy, with Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister. See, it wasn't, let me back up a step. This is how serious it had gotten. The Russians, of course, are threatening Belgium. If you let them use our frozen Russian assets, we're going to bring hell down on you. We're going to do it legally. We're going to sue Everclear. But they also were threatening individual officials, right? And then the Trump administration was threatening Europe, saying, we'll get this money back if you take these Russian assets. The reason why the Trump administration is doing this, by the way, is if Europe gets the Russian assets, you can't use the Russian assets for joint US-EU projects or joint US-Russian projects, right? So they're in the middle of all this, and the Americans were leaning on Giorgia Meloni. This is why I want to bring that up, right? And so Italy was like, we're not sure if we can go with the reparations loan. Meloni was very quiet during the first day, the Thursday, and then on the Friday she starts to intervene, and she supposedly is the person that brings the sides together to say, look, we're going to agree on the 90 billion loan on the capital markets. Now, for Giorgia Meloni to do that shows an element of pragmatism within the EU in terms of what needs to. Remembering that she's hard right, she's a hard right politician who Trump thought was going to be one of theirs. The other thing to mention out of this is that the EU again made sure that this decision didn't have to be unanimously approved. So not all 27 members had to sign on, and so Putin's friends within the EU, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Slovakia's Robert Fico. What are you going to do about them? What are you going to do about the new leader of Czechoslovakia, Babiš? At the end of the day, they're allowed to say, oh, we're not going to contribute any money to this 90 billion. So they can go back to their domestic populations and go, we don't support this, blah, blah, blah. And the EU says, fine, the other 24 of us are. I don't want to, look, I don't want to over dramatize this. This isn't, because it's not going to end the Russian invasion. It's not going to be the final resolution that you need to support Ukraine. But for the EU to be able to pull this together is a sign of continued resolve behind Ukraine. And that's a big moment. It's a moment that has sort of come and gone, but it's a big moment because it gives Ukraine that space as we go into 26. And you know it, and you know why it succeeded. Louis, you know why it succeeded, because that's why Putin was so pissed off this week. That's why he thought, we got him. They're not going to support us. They're going to come out weak. And when they didn't, that's when he comes up with that Nazi piglets line, and his officials as well, who said, Europe shouldn't have anything to do with this. Well, guess what, son? They're there. And I will emphasize, by the way, it's not just Europe, but there are other countries who have stepped it up in recent weeks as well, such as Canada. And I think what has been impressive is that caught between the determination of Vladimir Putin to seize another country and between the unpredictability and chaos of many of the people in the Trump White House, Ukraine still stands and Europe still stands behind it.
And just to finish then, Scott, this sort of, merry-go-round of diplomats from Russia and the US meeting each other, trying to agree on something, someone turns it down. That's not likely to be over even by Russian Christmas, is it? How likely is that to pretty much define the war in Ukraine for 2026 as well?
This doesn't end until the Russian economy gets to be so bad that Putin decides he can't keep prosecuting the invasion. I mean, that's where it's going to be. Now, how bad does it have to get, the Russian economy, before he decides that? That is the question that I don't think anyone here can answer. But, Ukraine cannot regain the territory that Russia already occupies in the country. So it's not going to resolve that way. On the other hand, as we've just explained, as long as Europe's behind Ukraine, unless you get a whole series of European governments that are toppled from within, and that you have probably far right or far left governments that refuse to support Ukraine, unless that happens, then Europe continues to stand. So where do you come out of this? And you come out of it in terms of exhaustion. Now, Ukraine's pretty tired, but the thing about Ukraine is, and if you folks don't know this by now, and if Putin doesn't know it by now yet, they are resilient. They are resilient. The fact of the matter here is the vast majority of Ukraine still do not want to give in to the Russians. I know that from personal experience as well. So that means, when does Russia get exhausted? All I can say to you here is that I'll put it down here that I think one reason why the Russians are stepping up their attacks and are stepping up all the psychological stuff to try to break Ukraine, and why they're stepping up the pressure on the Americans, is I think you look at a 6-month window, maybe 6 to 12 month window. And if we get to this point next spring and they still haven't broken Ukraine, because I'll just close with this. Mark Rutte said, Russia has 140 million people. We've got 1 billion, right, in Europe. But it's not just 1 billion. Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, countries such as that also are supporting that effort. Russia is relatively isolated. And again, for our friends, our pro-Kremlin friends who come into the comments, you come back at me and you tell me who stands with Russia in this invasion. Maybe the Chinese, behind the scenes, and we know that the Chinese are a big factor. North Korea, yay, good on you. Iran, yeah, good on you there. Belarus, well, there's another heavy hitter. The fact of the matter here is that Russia's relatively economically isolated, and that with their oil revenues drop by half, which is what it's projected to be by the end of the year, and if that projected drop in oil revenues lasts till the spring, what saves Vladimir Putin then is if the U.S. reverses its sanctions on Russian oil companies. If the U.S. does that, he gets another lifeline for the invasion. Watch J.D. Vance. It used to be Trump was Putin's savior. Now it's J.D. Vance. But if J.D. doesn't come in there and force the reversal of the sanctions, and I don't think he can because of Congress, 6 months.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.